Welcome to our webinar this morning on Healthy Connections, an inside scoop on adolescence and addiction. I'm Genevieve Eason with Wilton Youth Council, and I'm happy to have you here this morning. Thank you for making the time for it. This morning, we'll be hearing from Anthony Nave, a licensed clinical social worker with master's degrees in educational psychology and clinical social work, who's the senior manager of outpatient services at Mountainside Treatment Center. Tony is advanced certified in eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, and is currently an EMDR consultant in training and is experienced in medication-assisted treatment, co-occurring disorders, and adolescent programming. Tony designs curricula for clinical programming and incorporates neurobiology and a trauma-responsive framework into one-on-one counseling, group therapy, family sessions, and supervision. I want to say thank you this morning to our co-sponsors, SpedNet Wilton and Weston Youth Services, and to Mountainside for providing Tony for us this morning. I'm going to put all of the sponsors' websites in the chat, so you can be sure to visit them for more information. And I'm also going to be including Thea Ross's phone number. If you want to connect with Tony directly, Thea will be the person to contact. So this morning, we're in a webinar format. So if you have questions, we would love to be able to share your questions with Tony. Please enter them in the Q&A that you're going to find at the bottom of your screen. And Thea, who works with Tony at Mountainside, or Carrie Ann Finelli, who works on the Parent Education Committee for Wilton Youth Council, and I will read your questions to Tony and keep that conversation flowing. Before we get started, I just want to give you a quick reminder that Wilton Youth Council programs are for informational purposes only, do not constitute medical advice, and are not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. And please be mindful that this is an open forum that's being recorded, and we can't guarantee confidentiality, so you might not want to reveal any private information. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Tony. So thank you so much for being here this morning, Tony.
No problem. Good morning. So I'm Tony. I do, when I've done these, I do much better when I get questions throughout. So please don't be afraid to use the Q&A. Keeps me grounded and with you, but it also lets me know where everyone's at and where I need to go next as far as doing better explaining things. So keep the questions coming. I'm okay with that. Not sure if you can see the screen yet. Can you see the slideshow? Because I can.
We can see the slideshow. It looks great.
Awesome. So just a quick overview. It looks like a lot, but at the end of the day, we're going to understand what the relationship is between adolescence and addictions, or the possible relationship there could be, what's going on inside the brain for growing children, and how actually addiction as a disease can impact the brain, and then what we can do about it and what's out there for help if things are heading in a direction that someone's struggling with addiction. So again, any questions or concerns, I know it's a lot, just help me out and ask them along the way, and they will tell me what's going on or what needs to be answered. So thank you. So I'm just a quick background. I'm a big interpersonal neurobiology guy. I read a lot of Dan Siegel. A lot of sources for this will be from Dan Siegel, but at the end of the day, the key thing that will go to be the golden thread throughout this conversation is that as we develop, there's three main factors, major factors that help us develop as people, and that dimension is mind and brain, which we can think of as body, and relationships. So whether it's nurture and environment that impacts the brain, or even if it's genetic like potential, all three of these are the recipe for development. So keep that in mind as we go out throughout the presentation. I can answer more about that along the way, but that's the backdrop framework that we're going to use. So as we grow, as we develop, we have our mind that's able to sense ourselves, make mental maps, sense others, and then we have our body, which gives us all that information to process. And then we have relationships that gives us information as well, and that helps us grow and develop along the way, emotionally, cognitively, and socially. So using that framework, what's so different about adolescence? At the brain or the body itself, physically, we get a burst of of neurons, new developments. So we basically get this jump start to start growing even faster. So we get a bunch of neurons when we are born, and then we get a second bunch when we get into adolescence and hit puberty. And then after that, we got what we got, and we're working them as we go. So during that time frame or time of development, that part of the brain that we think is our personality, that new part of the brain, that front part. I don't know if you can see the cursor, but it's this front part behind the eyes that starts to develop. That helps us develop a personality, right or wrong, thinking about thinking, understanding others, empathy, all the things that we think about. That's us. And a good way to think of it too, it's also the break. It helps us think abstractly, and it helps us think about when's enough, or when's too much of a good thing is too much of a good thing. So that starts to really form during adolescence. So it's not fully developed yet, and it actually is all the reasons for puberty, they work together. So this idea of relationships, mind and brain, starts with this idea that physically the front part of our brain is going to start working. It's going to help us think of thinking instead of viewing things as black or white or concrete. We start thinking things more abstractly during this time of our lives, and it's because this part of the brain is starting to grow. At the same time, there's a imbalance, like a strategic imbalance. So the older part of our brain that just kind of reacts and views and thinks of when things feel good, that's a good thing to go back to, and everything in between, and makes us a little bit more on the impulsive side, is growing faster or has grown faster up to this point. And so there's the imbalance in ways. And this imbalance we'll talk a lot about later on is on purpose. And the reason for that is whether it's genetic potential or whether it's like in our own environment or nature, we need experiences to develop. And so as we get older, the balance gets a little bit better, right? We can think about things, we can think about our actions, we can analyze what's a good thing, what's not a good thing, how much is a good amount and what's not, whether it's interactions or work versus responsibilities or playtime versus work time, what's a good amount to eat, everything in between, right? But during this time, during adolescence, there's an imbalance, and we're encouraged to actually try more, have more experiences, do more things, because we need to have it's the brain's way of sparking growth. By having more experiences, we create more neural pathways, we have more relationships, more input, more genetic potential of everything that we get from our gene pool gets unlocked in good ways to move forward, be resilient, and become who we are going to be. Hopefully that makes sense. So if there's any questions or concerns there, please put them in the chat, and I'll do a better job of explaining it. And then there's this other part during adolescence, which is relationships. That's different from when we're young, from when we're older, is there's a shift. We start shifting from getting all of our information and experiences from our caregivers, and we look more towards peers, or we look more towards other, I don't necessarily say authority figures, but teachers, coaches, other people in the community, because we're exposed to a larger community now. We're not just in our initial internal families from growing up with parents, grandparents, or caregivers, or everything in between. Now we're expanding our world to peers and to others. So during this point, we're between the new growth of that new part of our brain and the older growth of wanting to have more experiences, we actually are looking to more people outside of what we're used to. So this is why we see our kids want to be with the other kids, and their kids actually learn more from kids than we start learning from the parents or caregivers at this time. And that's an intentional shift, right? That's to have more experiences, to expand, to unlock more potential. And then there's that overall shift from a concrete thinking of we get the black and white, we know the right and wrong from what our caregivers told us, from that kind of understanding to thinking about why is it right or wrong, to thinking about, well, who made the rules, and like, well, that's not always accurate. And so abstract thinking starts to form, and they definitely work on this in school with academics, but the abstract thinking, more often than not, we start getting that more and more from hanging out with peers, from our social relationships, from all the different activities that we do, whether it's sports clubs, spending time with friends, or getting different viewpoints from teachers or coaches or everything in between. So that's why all the right pieces are moving into place to expand and experience more during this period in our time, in our lives. So I'm just going to pause there quick. And Thea, did anything come up along the way?
No, it looks good, Tony. We can just move on.
Sweet. All right. So again, like the big overall theme is the name of the game is experiences, right? And the reason for that is this the concept of neuroplasticity, which is this idea that the brain is going to shift and move and physically create new neural pathways and new associations and systems and thoughts and everything of that kind of mentality, right? I don't want to dive too much into that, but basically the key point I want to take away here is we need to think of the brain like Play-Doh. All these different factors, whether in our lives, from our relationships to our experiences, to the people we're feeling, to our genetic traits and everything in between, they're all different factors that will help the brain take shape, create new pathways to grow. So our brains, because of neuroplasticity, our brain's always like this. It's always being shaped and molded by our experiences, our actions, and our genetic traits, all together in one recipe. It's never genetics is not more important than our environment, or our environment's not more important than genetics. It's just this dance between nature and versus nurture that's constantly shaping our brain. And again, because of that burst of neurons or potential that we get during puberty, our brain is even more malleable. It's even more able to be impacted physically, be shaped faster than the different parts of our lives. Okay, so that's a big thing to keep in mind as we go along, and that's going to be the big link of why all these different things matter. So going back to that intentional balance and thinking of our brain as Play-Doh, if we had the same kind of mentality or temperament as adults as we did as kids, we probably wouldn't get the full development or learn as much or be who we are, because we would be too conservative, right? We wouldn't have had as many experiences. We wouldn't have reached our full potential. We wouldn't have been able to grow so many different relationships if we were always being cautious and not getting into things and not trying things that were making us uncomfortable. And there's going to be give and take to that, which will, that's how we start to see the relationship with addiction and everything in between. But we need all of those experiences to help shape our brain physically and grow, because we need to understand how to regulate emotions, right? We need to be able to analyze right or wrong or think about different things and have a different kind of decision making as that new part of our brain grows. But that new part of our brain is only going to be as good based on how many different experiences we had. So the more data it gets, the faster and more fluid it gets to make decisions. So the more practice it gets, the more information it gets, the stronger and more developed it's going to be. And even along that process, if there's genetic traits of like resilience or all the things that we think of as like, I hope my kid gets this from their mother, or I hope it gets that from my dad, that is going to happen not just naturally on its own, but also in combination with the kind of experiences they have as they grow up. So that gets unlocked, right? Anything come up so far, Thea?
No questions right now. No.
All right. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but we'll keep moving along. So that's a lot of good stuff, right? We want experiences, we want to grow, we want to unlock potential and everything in between, and good. All right, so our kids are programmed to be more adventurous. So that means they can have more growth and development. The catch is that we're programmed to have more experiences that during adolescence. That means we could also have bad experiences. It's not going to filter the good or the bad. And this is where that relationship of engaging, whether we try drinking for the first time, or we smoke, or we try different things like Adderall, or if we just, start engaging in risky behaviors, like, all right, I'm not going to show up for curfew, or I am going to cut this class, or I'm going to do this and try this. We're more willing to do it thanks to all of the imbalances and the changes physically that's going on for us. Like, we're more willing to take that risk, right? That's why it feels like, even with my own kids, it falls on deaf ears. Like, really? Like, you thought that was a good idea to do that? This is why. They're actually being programmed to do the things that sound like a bad idea on purpose. So this is that where we take that triangle back into play between mind, brain, or really body when we say brain, and relationships. the more modeling and the more experiences our kids had to that point, whether we help them to understand, like take a pause, take a breath, let's do some breathing, hey, let's talk this out instead of just purely acting on the anger, or hey, like let's introduce you to some new friends, and these friends are good people, and they're even modeling how they deal with emotions and everything else in between. So this combination of positive relationships and our practice to understand what our body feels like, and encouragement to explore that and how to regulate it and everything in between all starts coming into play. So the more of these kind of protective factors that we have, it will help when we start experimenting with the risky negative things. Like, well, maybe we'll only do that once after we learn the hard way. Like, okay, yeah, that wasn't a good experience. I got the information I needed. I'll move on to the next one. And we'll talk even more about this later on. With if there's more risk factors at the time of these different experiences, people are going to be more willing to keep experimenting with the unhealthy stuff, or the risky stuff, I should say. So this the idea of healthy attachments with friends, or with school, with teachers, or at home with grandparents, cousins, everything in between. The more of this stuff that's happening for our kids, the better shape they're going to be in when they start getting into this period of their lives and experimenting and taking risks and having new experiences. Am I going too fast? Am I talking too much about one thing or the other? Like, what kind of questions we got out there? Help me out.
No, it's all good. I guess I would ask one question though, Tony. If somebody is like a child is like a real introvert and doesn't, just sort of shies away from the concept of relationships, how does that affect that triangle?
So it'll be less practice, less experiences. When I'm talking about relationships, and as we continue to move forward, keep in mind we don't need our kids to have like an army of friends. They just need one or two good ones to help us reach these kind of potentials, and that's been based on numerous different researches along the years and along the way. It's not that we need a lot of friends. I'm not saying a lot of friends is bad. I'm saying we need some good ones that that we're willing to be vulnerable with, that we're willing to have some trust and explore different things with. Those kind of healthy attachments, even if there's one or two, is good. So if you do have a son or a daughter that's it's hard and they struggle to have relationships, just helping them along the way to have one or two is a good thing. Not necessarily they're not going to be limited, or they're not going to be set back if they only have one or two good friends. One or two good friends is sometimes all we need. I saw a message pop up, but I'm not sure. I didn't catch it before it went away.
Here's a question for you. And it's from somebody in the audience. Can you tell us more about how addiction is an attachment disorder? Maybe this is something you're going to talk about later. How can parents know if their kids have healthy attachments?
So the reason why the relationship between healthy attachments and addiction is we're programmed to have relationships, period. Like, we need the relationships, we need these kind of experiences and development, and that happens from birth and all the way through our lives. So if we struggle to have that one or two good friends, or feel safe with our caregivers or things like that, we're going to want to connect to something. And I think a lot of times, and in a lot of different books or different experiences that I hear from sessions and groups, what we connect to can be a substance. It could be alcohol. It could be weed. It could be Adderall, or it could be, for others, when we start gambling, or for some people, this is where those of us that struggle with work and maybe work too much all the time instead of having the balance with home, we start relying on things or actions or behaviors that will be consistent relationships for us, that we think are giving us what we need. Right? So if we struggle to have those healthy relationships with people and the community in our lives, and that we don't feel as connected, we start looking for other things to connect to, because that's the way we're programmed to have those experiences. So I think that's the biggest theme, or when we try to view addiction as attachment disorder, it's if we struggle and we have insecure or unhealthy attachments just at a baseline, we're going to look for other things to connect to, whether that's beer, whether that's weed, whether that's I'm going to escape and only just go to the gym and never do anything else, or start taking risks and gamble in sports. All that kind of stuff comes into play. We're more willing to grow those relationships with those risky behaviors or substances because we didn't have healthy ones to help us stay in balance, or to help us in those experiences understand and regulate when those risky behaviors were not so great. They got me into trouble or things like that. We don't know that because we didn't have that input or that ability to rely on the other positive relationships in our lives. Hopefully that helped make sense of that idea of addiction as attachment disorder. For an even more like in-depth conversation, Johann Hari is out there on a lot of different TED Talks or YouTube videos and books. He's written about like the opposite of addiction is connection, and he talks about we should think more of addiction as a bonding disorder than necessarily just a straight up disease to a substance. It's not necessarily the substance, it's the idea that we couldn't connect to other things in life, so we connected to something, and the drugs are always there and the risky behaviors are always there, so they feel like a more healthy attachment than what we have going on in our lives. If we're
Can you
struggling.
repeat that name, Tony, and I'll put it in the chat.
Sure. Johann Hari. I think his last name they spell it is Hari.
Okay, we have several other questions
Sure. Good.
along these lines.
People are awake. Let's go for it.
Okay. I mean, one that I think ties directly to what you've just been discussing is how do we help our kids make friends, especially right now when everyone's so isolated?
It's been this is the constant battle because with our youngest son, this is supposed to be the first grade, and he only had half of kindergarten, so he wants to be with his friends. So doing the best we can during this time, I think some of the ideas that we had, how do we replicate recess? It's not getting recess from distance learning, so let's call the other parents, even though it's uncomfortable as heck to call strangers, hey, I know my kid's in class with you, but let's set up a Zoom conference or a video conference and they can just play. So it's trying to do those kind of those scenarios where it's more play and at a time when everything's restricted. So I know that sports is hard to do, or music's going to be hard to do, but trying to do the best we can with the resources we have. And right now that's technology, that's web conferencing. So we've been setting up some video conferences for my youngest to just hang out and play with his action figures, play with guys, and do that kind of thing. My middle son has been calling two of his friends, and they're in a band, but they've been basically playing from their bedrooms through video conference or Google Duos, practicing their music. And I know that my oldest has been swapping different songs and albums with his friends and then calling to talk about it. So we're trying to do the best we can through the virtual tools that we have, thinking of how they might do it in the neighborhood, right? Hopefully that helps. All of us together will come up with way more answers, and I talk about this all the time. More than one head is better than one. So the more creative we can get with how we can set up the space to have experiences in relationships, the better our chances.
Yeah. Maybe folks who've had some success brainstorming ideas around this can put them in the chat for everybody to see. We have, one of our co-sponsors this morning is SpedNet Wilton, which is the special education network in Wilton. And we have some questions that are related to some of these needs. I'm going to put them together and you can sort of address them. You may have to address them separately, but I'll ask the two questions together. How does ADHD impact this? Because there's an increased need for stimulation there. And also, how does nonverbal learning disability or other learning differences contribute to addiction? I don't know if you want to tackle both of those separately, but I thought it would be useful for you to hear them together.
No, but it's helpful because it's the same. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor. Does it show up on the slideshow, or is it just showing the slides?
You do see the cursor, yes.
Awesome. So ADHD and those kind of other learning disabilities and things of that nature, the impact is it's another risk factor, or it's going to make us work harder to develop that front part of our brain, that prefrontal cortex, the part that thinks about right and wrong, the part that can be the brake, the part that's our personality, because of it's creating more brain activity in the older part of our brain. So when someone's struggling with, whether it is addiction or someone struggling with ADHD, it's basically firing off the older part of our brain and spending more time in there. And I tend a little bit later, I'll show how, like I say, it's a wall that cuts us off between the old part of our brain and this new part of brain. But really, it's we're not having enough firing of neurons or firing up experiences in that front part of the brain to grow and basically have more like reps at a gym or run longer. So it's not impossible. It's just another challenge that gets, it's a risk factor. It's another thing that builds up that we have to kind of work around and find other ways and add more to the table, more supports to try and create and generate more experiences to exercise that part of the brain that basically has almost like it's a good metaphor, thinking of like bodyguards or more potholes that gets in the way of trying to get to that firing neurons to that side of the brain. Hopefully that helps or makes sense.
That's great. Thank you. A quick just point of clarification. Someone wants to know, what age do you consider adolescent? Middle schoolers, high schoolers? How do you define an adolescent?
So I feel like this age has changed from even when I was in college and then going forward, the more and more. So I think it fits along that line of the idea of the brain as Play-Doh. Different times in our lives, we maybe our grandparents or our great grandparents before that, we used to think of adolescence as like purely in school, and then people after 18 were like adults, right? But if we were living a different way and generating different experiences for those kids, then yeah, maybe they've developed faster, right? But at this point in our lives, just based on different lifestyles and different things going on, I would say that adolescence could be anywhere from like tweens, 12, 13, all the way up into our mid 20s, maybe even 30s, depending on the different things that are going on for people. Like we talked about ADHD and other mental health or factors could be barriers for that full development. So a lot of the studies have shown that basically our brain continues to develop fairly rapidly up into like 25 to 30. So we can think of adolescence. I know traditionally we think of adolescence as middle school kids and high school kids, but depending on the different things that happen in a kid's life, they could their development could be further back, and so they do more developments in their 20s.
Great. Now
Yeah.
I'm going to put together, there's just a few, there's a few more questions, but I see a common link through them, which is I think some anxiety parents have around the idea of this link between lack of attachment and addiction, or attachment as a protective factor preventing addiction, and being concerned about whether or not we're providing enough opportunities for attachment. So there are a few questions that sort of all go together in that vein. One is around, how do we balance giving our kids agency to explore and experiment and have experiences that are good for growth, but not be too controlling as a parent, especially when they get into high school and they're exposed to a lot more. Wilton is a fairly affluent community. Are there risk factors in an affluent community? I mean, I have heard speakers talk about the fact that when kids have a lot of spending money, that can be a risk factor for experimentation with substances because they can afford it. But what do you think are the types of things that maybe get in the way of attachment in an affluent community? And then also, obviously, now we're living in a virtual world. We're not getting to sit at the library with you and have this conversation in person, and our kids aren't getting to do that either. So how is the shift to a virtual world maybe affecting healthy attachment? So I think all of those are somewhat connected. I'm wondering how can we think about these obstacles or barriers to connection and attachment, and also, how much freedom we give our kids to explore these things.
So I think the key thing to, before I even get to that, this is like the constant battle between my wife and I, right? Because I'm more along the lines of like, all right, life lesson, let's just be there to support them after they learn that. Versus like, let's prevent those from happening. But the idea is not to be perfect and not to be like not enough. The goal is to be more often than not. That balance of having more healthy experiences and good things happen, and being attuned and being helpful and being there for our kids more times than not, but not all the time, is the goal, right? The reason why more often than not is because we need to have some of those experiences where kids do navigate. Agency was good, sense of agency, good work, I like that. To be able to navigate things on their own, right? And I think an earlier question I didn't necessarily quite answer fully is like, how do we know if our kids are having healthy attachments? I think of those old school examples of like when kids are younger, toddlers, infants. You go to a party, you go to the park, maybe kids are feeling a little bit anxious and they view you as a secure base or a secure person, so they hang out around you for a little bit, but then after they're co-regulating and feel soothed being around you because of your healthy attachments and security that you give them, they're willing to walk away from you and go to the slide, or they're willing to go to a different family member at the party or different kids at the party and explore, right? How does that translate to now? It's like our kids hopefully being able to, do some of these. We can set up some meetings and maybe they pick up the theme and then make it their own, right? Have their own phone calls, text their own friends, set up their own chats, or have come up with their own ideas. These ideas of the virtual band came from my middle son, like from Gavin. He understood and came up with the idea. I'm like, I want to do this band. We were like, I used to do it after school when his friend Joey would pick him up. But we don't have the after school hangouts anymore. And while they wait for us to get back from work at my friend's neighbor's house. So what they did is they came up with the idea of video chats on their own. What do they need from us for support? Like how to do it. Like, so helping them navigate how to do that chat, making sure like, all right, we're going to do this for you, but like, listen, there's some guidelines. Like, I don't want you venturing off into random websites. You're only going to use this website because we checked it out together. Like, you're only going to use this form. You're going to tell me when you're video conferencing, because I don't want you video conferencing random people. All right, I want you just video conferencing Joey or your other bandmate. So that's the balance, and more often than not, I'm going to set up some parameters and guidelines and be transparent about my own concerns while you're doing it, so you understand it's not just some arbitrary rule, right? And then I'm going to give you the space to explore it with the people that are safe for you, with Joey and your friend that I know and met, and with this app that we've used together, and I put limits and restrictions on who can come and go. So I think that's going to be a lot of what it looks like right now, and the impact of what the pandemic, and there's a slide later on, is going to be on all of us, really. We're going to learn along the way for years to come. But if we're doing our best and we're coming up with things more often than not, and we're modeling that kind of resilience, like I'm not perfect, but we're figuring this out together, in that kind of sense, we're forming healthy attachments. We're still being able to have that attunement to each other and understand like things are great. I'm anxious. It's okay to be anxious. Let's do this together. Then we start to calm down a little bit, and then we come up with something new. We're actually have an opportunity to model a kind of resilience that we wouldn't be able to potentially model in different experiences. So there's a give and take. There is opportunity in different kinds of crises to build resilience and have experiences that can lead to healthier growth. Hopefully that helped.
That helps a lot. And the questions are rolling in, which is great, but let's keep moving through your presentation, and you may answer some of them as we go, and we'll keep taking them a little bit here and there. I want to make sure you get through all the material you have to share.
No problem. So the biggest story is going to be risk and protective factors, right? Like, just because you have a family history of addiction in your family, it doesn't mean it's a death sentence that your kids are going to be addicts, right? It just means that's one risk factor. And if we balance it out with other risk factors like healthy relationships, or being able to model different ways to cope with emotions, or give people the supports they need, like there's different things that we can do that will allow the brain to shape itself with a healthier pathway, right? It won't be short-circuited, or won't be at the risk of the genetic potential for addiction. So yes, genetics could be a risk factor or part of someone developing addiction. So be aware of it. Talk about it when it's the right moment, and right. So that's part of the experience and part of the transparency. So that potential risk can actually become a protective factor of being, well, let's be transparent. You and I are going to have a better relationship. and be attuned, I'm not gonna lie to you. Yeah, I wouldn't be trying that stuff too often, because if we resort to that to help us feel good all the time, there's a risk it's in our family, right? Other more often than not, struggling with addiction. There's even one author, Dr. Mate, who says like most addictions come from trauma, but then we go back to this idea of viewing addiction as an attachment disorder. Like if things happen in our lives that whether we had other barriers like ADHD or depression or anxiety, or lost this person in a car accident, or there's this kind of physical or emotional abuse around, or everything in between. These are all different kinds of risk factors that can build up and build up. And if they outweigh the protective factors, then the relationship between us and addiction can grow, right? And because that can feel like, well, all these different things feel uncertain. Everything that's happened so far just feels bad, but these things are always here and I feel good when I have them. So that's when that relationship, we start fostering and growing with a risky behavior like gambling or just unhealthy relationships, toxic relationships, or substances themselves. So it's always like, it's just constant balance with neuroplasticity. What factors can we add in place to counteract or outmaneuver those other factors that could lead to negative outcomes, or in this case, addictions, or cutting school, or getting into bad habits with study habits, or like getting with the wrong crowd of people. Any questions or concerns there? That was a lot. So if you have any questions, I get it. So help me out. How do I clear that up for you, everyone?
Well, we have one question that I do think applies here. Isn't ADHD a huge risk factor? This person says they've read that kids with ADHD are looking for, quote, blasts from dopamine because ADHD brains don't have enough dopamine. Drugs are one of the experiences that give them that blast of feeling good. So I think, and then there's also related questions. What are some strategies for a child with ADHD, regulation, impulse control issues, who has food addiction, sweets addiction? What language can we use when we talk about this? And you may be getting to strategies a little later, in which case we can address that then. But how for people who are concerned about this, these particular risk factors, do you have any sort of additional thoughts on ADHD as a risk factor?
So ADHD is a risk factor in impulsivity. So it's going to require more attention or awareness, unfortunately, on our part, right? Like we sometimes have to model the empathy that our kids would need to have for themselves if they have ADHD, right? Like, hey, I know you didn't mean it, but that was a little bit much. Let's figure out a different way to do this. Let's try this instead, right? I know a lot of the schools have a lot of supports and different ways to manage and coping, whether it's structuring routine or making lessons shorter or adding more movement breaks or everything in between. We can kind of take what we want and like from the school, transport it home, and we can take those tactics and movements and those strategies that work at home and put them in school. The repetition and the practice can strengthen that prefrontal cortex and grow and increase more protective factors than it resulting in a risk factor that leads to other developments or struggles. So it would be a whole training to talk about the different strategies, but basically the things that help soothe and calm, and adding that in, practicing it, modeling it yourselves to your own kids, and making it part of your routine, and understanding some structure, some balance, basically creating opportunity to coach balance, have balance, and be aware of it, to help with these different barriers and things that come up when you struggle with ADHD. That help? That makes sense?
Yes, thank you, Tony.
Okay. So we were talking about the pandemic before. So grief and loss, and I guess some of this could be, some of this probably will be talked about more as a trauma later on. I think the only thing comparable to what we're going through is probably the Great Depression at this point. And so the impact of the pandemic can be a risk factor all in itself, because we had lost access to friends, to family, to lifestyles, to routine, to be able to practice different healthy coping skills, whether that's going for hikes or walking or being able to play sports or to go be at the the music school to practice band or this or that. Like, yeah, that kind of stuff is impacted. It's limited, right? We can do our best and try different ways to find ways to do that and work around it, whether it's through web conferencing or just doing it together in the house. But then we also have the death of loved ones and us struggling on our own as well. Like this pandemic's impacting us, right? So it's its own special kind of risk factor to recognize. And I think the practice of awareness and the transparency of it, because we want to create experiences of, I know that we are struggling with our own emotions and we don't want to, be completely show everything to kids because we don't necessarily put everything in crisis, but we need to be transparent, right? Yeah, I'm struggling with this. This is frustrating me. I miss this. I want to do that, right? So we create a space, a warm holding environment where we're showing it's okay to have these emotions, and then we're able to model and show how we cope with them. Like, all right, but let's try this today, even though we can't do that, or let's work with this today, or like let's just be okay with that being not available, and I'm going to talk about it being that how much that sucks and be out in the open about it. Because I think going back to talking about how do we get to like unhealthy relationships, the better we practice being transparent with our own emotions. I mean, we're not going to give the whole piece of it raw to everyone. We're going to just be transparent enough that we are struggling. Let's not keep it a secret that we're not, because sometimes that can be misleading, right? And just add to feeling even more isolated. Well, crap, I'm like mom and dad are doing great with this. I'm like, or my grandparents are doing great with this, or the teachers are doing great with this, but I'm struggling, so something must be wrong with me. So if people are able to be a little bit more transparent during this time, to like let people know it's hard, but we can still figure this out together as we move through, is going to foster more protective factors, healthy relationships, attunement, how to model how to cope with anxiety or grief and loss. Any questions or concerns there? I know that's probably another big one too. And I saw some things popping up on the bottom screen.
No, I don't think we have any questions on this slide. Thank you.
Okay. So understanding addiction as a disease. I always talk about just thinking of these things as highways.
You know what, Tony, can we take a step back? A question just popped up on that last one. How do you balance being transparent about struggling without being too damaging to kids?
So my youngest son, he's not a big fan of distance learning, but he gets it, right? And my wife has been great with helping with the teaching of all the different classes, but they had their own shouting matches and frustration, and it wasn't necessarily them, it's the situation itself. So my wife's done great in the sense that like, I know this sucks, Evan. Like I don't like this too. I want you to be at school with your friends because I know that's probably more fun than being with me. But however we figure this out, we'll figure it out together, right? Like I don't like seeing this either. This is hard for me too, because I want to be able to give you more. I don't always get it myself. Like being transparent and enough with those kind of things as those experiences happen. So it's going to require a lot from us, because when we get stuck in those heated moments or those arguments of like, okay, like come back from your break, let's do this, we need to get this done. Being transparent in that situation, like I know this sucks, this is frustrating. Come back to the table, we'll get this done, we'll figure out how to like reward ourselves for putting this in. I don't like this either. Like that kind of transparency, that kind of conversation, as opposed to bottling up our frustration, putting on a good show of like, well, get back to the table or you're gonna lose this, right? Like small doses, small amounts, the right amount, feels right in the moment kind of amounts of being able to share that you're struggling too, but we're working through it. So we continue to foster that resilience and foster a healthier, attuned relationship, right? Because we are at the risk that if we don't be transparent enough, kids can start thinking it's them, like they're the problem, right? Because they can feel the tension, they can feel everything, but they don't necessarily have the same kind of abstract thinking we have to think about all the different reasons why this is terrible. They can start thinking it's more personal. Makes sense? Sound good?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Okay. We didn't talk about that last slide. So actually, it's probably helpful. This is where Thea talks about drawing. Like, I wish we were in the rooms and could have the whiteboard and everything in between, but I'm going to try and show you this model. Just trying a substance doesn't mean addiction. I know that seems counterintuitive to this idea of chemical hooks and things like that. Yes, it creates more of a risk factor, the chemical hooks from different substances to excite in the dopamine rush, but it's the repetition, right? And this is where those protective factors and risk factors comes in. So basically, if someone has a drink or abuses Adderall or finds someone's old pills or smokes weed, what happens is this area of the brain, I'm glad you can see the cursor, fires up, right? It gets activated, it feels a lot, it gets overwhelmed. And then at the same time, if we repeat that experience over and over, remembering that our brain is like Play-Doh, we start shaping a new pathway, right? A healthy circuit or healthy highway would be, we come across something in our day, whether it's food or water or a safe person, a release of dopamine happens here. It triggers us to start remembering where this came from, what happened, where did I get it, how do I get it again? And then it goes to that new part of the brain that's developing and processes, right? Okay, we found cake in the kitchen by going to this cabinet, opening that cabinet, and I got a rush when I saw the cake, and that felt really good when it tasted good. But then this part's going to analyze, well, having cake all the time is actually going to make me feel crappy after a while instead of always being good. So there's got to be a balance to that. So then it sends a signal back, right? Regulates this rush of emotions, and then reality tests the information of where we got it from, people, places, and things, and puts a brake on everything, right? So this movement is a healthy circuit. When we overwhelm and come out of our window of tolerance, whether with any kind of substance or activity that rushes dopamine, what happens is it just goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and it doesn't get a chance to get processed. And eventually a new highway is formed that just, instead of going a full circle around, a short circuit happens where it just goes back and forth between reward happened, I get a rush of dopamine, I remember where it came from, and I just want to go right back and feel that feeling again. And it just goes back in circle in repetition, right? So not one or two times or a few times or a few experiences is going to create an addiction. What's going to happen is if we have less protective factors, so we don't necessarily have healthy relationships, or we don't have ways to cope with anxiety, or we don't have we have other things going on in our lives like depression or ADHD, that keeps us from being able to tap into this new part of the brain that's going to regulate emotions. It makes us more susceptible to stay here and keep this area activated and this area less. And I have slides to show everyone. Basically, it's like dad bod. If you don't use it, you lose it, right? So this is going to get mushy and it's not going to be as strong. So it's not going to help you regulate emotions as much, and you're just going to hang out in this brain more often than not, which is the impulsive, reactive. Let's just do things that feel good. Hopefully that makes sense. Sound good? So, all right, all those different risk factors and risk factors, think of them more like a wall that's blocking off this part of the brain to be able to exercise, work out, and start regulating everything that's going on in the older part of the brain. It's more about survival and reacting and feeling good. This slide is just to further show that circuit, right? On the left is a healthy brain. If we're firing around, we're starting in that old part of the brain, that limbic system that thinks about survival, instantly feels good in the middle part of the brain, in the pleasure center, right? And then it comes back around and gets analyzed. Like, okay, that's not small amounts with that, or let's not do that again because I smoked that weed and I end up doing something stupid and getting in a fight over here, right? And luckily my friend was able to pull me out and talk to me about like, let's not do that again, right? So then we come back around and we reality test and we store it correctly, but we're not going to repeat that pattern over and over, right? And this is a different angle. It'll show that kind of circuit. Start in the older brain, get fired up, feel the different emotions and all the different reactions, come through in memories and store where to get it from, come back to the front and get analyzed, and then come back around, right? This is all happening more, it's not a linear kind of a thing, it's more like lightning bolts. So this is all lining up at around the same time and it's pretty quick. But the repetition of abusing a substance over and over again will it is like a wall where it cuts off that part of the brain that can analyze, that can be the break, that can be no right or wrong, can think about different scenarios. Instead, we're just going to live in the old part of the brain. Reaction, feel good, pleasure center, send a signal back to go get more, back and forth, and just keep living in this part. As a consequence, if we're not sending neurons or electricity like we are here to over here, we're not working that part of the brain out. It's going to be the break. It's going to put the kibosh on this. It's going to be our personality to understand that this is too much. This is not a good thing. Any questions or concerns there? Hopefully the images help. I wish I could do the whole UPS whiteboard thing that I've done in the room with in these other presentations, but.
We do have a couple of questions on this. The first one is, how exactly do healthy attachments buffer against this? Do they act like a break?
So that's a really good question. So healthy attachments, what they do, if in this conversation that you and I are in right now, we're actually firing off neurons in that new part of the brain. So what that's doing is it's working out the part of the brain that can abstract think, that can be the break about different things and scenarios, all just by trying to stay in the conversation with me, right? If you've been watching me, you've been picking up and feeling that maybe I'm anxious because I like stutter over a word or talk fast or something. That fires off more information in this part of the brain. It makes your own kind of like mental map of how I might be feeling, right? And then almost like working out at the gym, if you're doing curls, you're working out your biceps, which is one part of the muscle, is just feeling attuned and empathy. The next bicep, maybe you change it up and you do hammer throws or something to get that top muscle, which is separate yourself. So this brain's working even harder to recognize that's his feelings, not my feelings, but I can still empathize and understand why. Like all of that is firing off electricity and neurons and working out that part of the brain. Healthy attachments, the more attuned and comfortable you are with someone, that action of empathizing, attuning, creating a mental map of how they might be feeling, then creating another idea of how that's them, this is me, is even further firing off neurons, and they're longer. Almost like a marathon now, to be able to sit in a conversation, understand how someone's feeling, and then recognize that's their feelings, not mine, is working out the part of the brain that will stop or regulate or make better choices or navigate dangerous situations better when I happen to get into them. And so that's how healthy relationships, the bulk of it can help. And then there's the other part of it too, where if you are in a healthy relationship with someone that maybe has had different experiences that are good or has some good insight, they're going to share them with you too, so they can reality test some of the decisions you're making and bounce ideas off you. And then together, which even fires off that part of the brain too, you're going to be in a better position to navigate risky situations and have a stronger break or a stronger decision maker or a stronger emotion regulator. So that's how, hopefully that helps explain that.
It does. Thea, did you have something you wanted to jump in with?
Yeah, just a little housekeeping. Tony, you might just want to turn off your Outlook on your computer, so your emails don't pop up on the or it could be yours or mine or one of ours. I did the same. So
thank you.
okay.
I'm gonna try and, that's different than Teams. So you guys can see my whole desktop, huh?
No, you just list little notifications sometimes on the
yeah.
On the,
Okay.
Mine too, Tony. So because we're both on the
and then okay. Are you ready for the next question?
Sure.
Okay. How do you stop this circuit, the looping pattern of addiction? What happens to people with OCD? What are their risk factors for addiction?
So you don't necessarily, and this is probably a good slide, you don't necessarily stop the circuit from, once addiction is formed, it's formed. And this is where this is where the idea of it's a lifelong thing. But what in reality what happens is you restart the healthier circuit, right? By different, whether you get into treatment or whether you use community supports or whether you have healthier relationships again and you're trying different coping skills that are different than using substances, what you're doing is, instead of going to this, riding this short circuit, because your brain always has that neuroplasticity and is like Play-Doh, you're going to reshape again with the more experiences and the more practice of the healthier skills of coming back around into the full circuit instead of this short circuit that just goes back and forth, right? So in reality, you stop by practicing and experiencing the other coping skills outside of drugs or gambling or media or exercise and that kind of thing, right? So basically by doing the other thing, you started forming the Play-Doh again, a road or a pathway that loops all the way back around and comes back through the front, that prefrontal cortex, and works that part of the brain out. So even though that pathway for addiction stays there, it gets overgrown. And this is where the idea of like roads comes into play. I always explain like your construction team built a new road that comes all the way back around again when you try different things other than addiction, help like treatment, coping skills, community supports, all that kind of stuff to work around that highway. And that highway gets overgrown. It gets vegetation, potholes, everything in between. The reason why it's lifelong is that pathway is there. Maybe it's just a less attractive road and creepy after a while, but someone who has addiction for a while, maybe has 5 to 10 years sober, they have a drink, it's not that they're going to go right back. What you can think of is that, okay, by having a drink, I started weeding that pathway, making it look a little bit more attractive. The next night, if I have a couple more drinks, I started repaving that highway. And then by the third night, someone might be back in where they were at their worst moments before achieving sobriety, right? And they're just using that highway again and forgot about this other pathway. Makes sense? Sound good?
It does. And along those lines, we have a couple of questions around this developing pathways. One is what are some strategies for fostering healthy pathways in our kids' minds? Like are there strategies for that? You may be getting to that. And then the other is for people who are already experiencing addiction. Is there a way to, what are some of the ways you can restructure that, or do things like EMDR or neurofeedback contribute to restructuring and creating these different pathways?
So all those different theories that are interventions or models help. I think everything's done in stages, right? It's once you have that relationship with substances or something else, it's hard. So if you think about even your personal relationships or your breakups or things like that, one of the first things you did was you took yourself out of the dangerous situation, right? Whether that is like going to your parents' house, or I'm just hanging out with my guy friends instead of hanging out with my ex more. Like you removed yourself from being around it, right? So for those who are struggling with addiction, like that's detox, that's residential, right? That's changing your environment to try and get away with it, so you get a chance to start trying to practice different coping skills, right? So that's the kind of the first steps, and then it's this thinking of mind, brain, and relationships. I had the pleasure of working for Mountainside, so we have a holistic approach. First, we have the community of being in residential or detox or alumni or community supports out there. That's that relationship factor. That's going to start trying to fire up this pathway and neurons, right? Then we have the potential of trying, whether it's qigong or meditation or acupuncture or all these different things, to start trying to soothe the physical struggles of first starting to heal from addiction, because it's not comfortable. So having other coping skills available to practice is already starting that healing process. And then treatment, whether it's EMDR, CBT, motivational interviewing, all that other stuff, is just another environmental factor that's going to promote this pathway to be used. And the next slide, like, it's not necessarily a wall. This is what a healthy brain looks like with it as we're moving along throughout life. Nice folds and everything in between. But this is that dad bod experience. So if you're only living, and if you think about the part of the brain I'm talking about is your thumb, and if you close your fingers over your thumb, that we're only using that part when we struggle with addiction, and this folded over part of that is what we're looking at in this picture, which is that prefrontal cortex. that's how they get the dad bod and it doesn't get used. So it looks more like this. And basically when we start working out again, trying different coping skills, being in different relationships, being in a healthier situation, we start slowly working the brain back out again and getting these nicer folds instead of this kind of like mush. Not strong enough to put a break on things. Did that help?
It does. So what I'm hearing is there's no one strategy. It's a combination of many different things in these different domains that you've been talking about. And there are different things you can try in each domain, but some combination of covering all of those things is going to be important for both prevention and recovery.
Yep. And a lot of it's timing too. So whether you're struggling or trying to heal from trauma or addiction, you need that bottom up process, which is more of, I'm going to do healthier coping skills or activities that, are going to start in the same place where I feel good from addiction, and find other ways to soothe and regulate those emotions working bottom up. So that could be meditation, breath work, acupuncture, conversations with emotional supports, instead of necessarily coming right at people with like CBT kind of therapy. Let's reality test our thoughts, which is more of a top down, using that part of the brain, this part of the brain that's already like struggling. And I use that example of, if you're going to ask a 400-pound person to do 600 sit-ups right off the rip, you're gonna be banging your head against the wall because they're not able to do that at this moment. So you got to do something else first, whether that's starting to walk or changing diet, to work on the bottom up to get to a point where they can start using that part of the brain that was damaged from addiction and to heal again.
That makes sense. There are more questions coming in, but I think we should continue through your presentation and then take the rest of them at the end.
Sure. So the drift or the signs of struggling that we may see with adolescents, and I'm going to preface this, by the way, because we've all been through puberty. Like, we know the craziness of puberty. So this is what makes it even harder for us to kind of pick up on something that's going wrong, right? Because some of these overlap with the natural experience of puberty. Keeping in mind that the beginning kind of triangle, right? Relationships, strain with prior healthy attachments, right? Strain with caregivers, strain with friends that used to be good friends. You start seeing your son or daughter get isolated from friends, families, or clubs. We start quitting the teams or coming back and doing less and less and less and being more and more on our own, right? That's a scenario. Isolation is a scenario. The other scenario too is, because we're willing to take risks and try new things, we may hang out with new people. And sometimes the new people are not always in the best of shape either, right? And have their own struggles. If we feel more comfortable being in those toxic relationships, that can be another sign of struggling, right? And then struggling to form new connections, right? So if someone is starting to abuse weed or drink, and without us knowing, some of the first things that we can see if it's getting out of hand is the impact it has on their relationships. That's one area to see if there's drift or struggle. The other is mood, and this is where, like, I preface this. I know it's not going to be easy because puberty is anywhere the wind blows as far as mood. But when we think of mood, like, what's their appearance? What's their complexion? What, like, you're seeing scabbing, cuts, bruises, things like that. I know people watch the movies and shows all the time where they're using eye drops to cover irritated eyes from smoking weed or things like that. Just for reference, right? You constantly see your son or daughter whose pupils are pinned, like really small. Like, they might be abusing some kind of downer, some kind of opiate or something else in between, benzo. Stimulants like Adderall, or if people get into cocaine or anything that speeds you up and abuse it, you're going to see, wider dilated pupils and things like that. Doesn't mean you shouldn't be getting in the face of your kids and every day and things like that, but seeing that paired with isolation or struggling relationships or mood swings that can't be explained, sleep patterns that start getting out of funk, memory loss and concentration and things like that starting to get impaired. Morning sickness, right? If someone's drinking or doing a lot of different substances, they're not going to be so great in the morning, right? There's potential for like withdrawal over time, right? You're going to see all these things. Some other things you'll probably see more faster is the negative change in school, like their performance is different. They're not doing as well as they used to, or they're not showing up as much, or there's the passion's not as there, or they're struggling to perform in their sports teams and music, band, anything in between, art. It's not the same anymore, or a change in sleep patterns, right? I know this pandemic has been crazy, and I'm still trying to get over the fact that my son keeps waking up at noon, but he's doing his thing. When I say that, like, you might start seeing your kids like not out during social activities or things like that, or you might see them be up all night when everyone else is sleeping because they're out and about doing different things that are risky and all that stuff in between. Substances will impact sleep patterns, even at a more dramatic level than puberty itself will at some point. Aggression, engaging in more risky behaviors, things like these are all different kinds of signs and observations you can make to see if you a loved one's struggling. Any questions or concerns there?
Let's keep, I want to make sure we get through all your material, so let's hold the rest of the questions to the very end.
I think some of the more obvious signs too is if you find stuff. So if you find empty bottles, lips, or anything else in between, if you find old scripts that don't even like from your family, or they are from family members and they shouldn't be here, things like that, benzos, Adderall, opiates, those could be signs. And the other, bongs, glass pipes, rolling paper, cigars, dime bags, all signs that maybe someone's smoking weed or everything in between. And I know that a new age kind of way to do all this is vaping. So if you see vapes, tanks, e-cigarettes, e-pens, dab pens, just know that it's not just nicotine. A lot of people are using them for THC as well. And THC boiled down to this oil form, it's not as regulated, and it's not always what people expect for THC. The other thing is how they mix these chemicals together. The biggest thing, a lot of the scenarios or news articles you see of kids ending up in the hospitals from vaping, more often than not, is when they are smoking THC oil. And there's different chemicals and mixtures like vitamin E that you may have in your body lotion is being put as a thickening agent in these THC oils. But when you heat them, so it was safe when it was in an oil form, but when you heat it and turn it into gas, it actually just creates a thick film that just clouds your lungs. And that's why a lot of times why you see kids end up in the hospital from the vapes. And it makes sense if you think about learning about yourself and trying new things to figure out your personality. Vapes, tanks, e-cigarettes, e-pens, all this kind of stuff. One, right, we enjoy fads during adolescence. It's not a fad, but it's also popular. It's also something you can change. You can change the different parts of it. You can make it different colors. You can have the different flavors. You can adjust it to your personality and experiment with an endless amount of different possibilities. So, and then it's portable and with you and easy to access. So these are all the things that make it attractive for an adolescent to try. So hopefully, I know vaping's come up a lot and it's probably a training in itself. But any questions or concerns, I'll be happy to try and answer them in the time we got. Speaking of vapes, this is tanks and mods. This is the e-cigarettes, all right? And I think more often than not, you'll see these, or dab pens. Dab pens are one hitters are like really high concentrations of THC at time if you're smoking THC versus the nicotine or tobacco. Any questions, concerns there?
No, nothing specific to this. Thank you.
So how do you, where do you start? You start by having the conversation itself, right? Even though it's awkward and doesn't feel right, and like, really, we're gonna have this kind of conversation about substances, but part of that healthy relationship that your son or daughter can have with you is the transparency aspect, right? Going into the conversation like, hey, I am concerned, using I statements is a big thing, because that is an invitation, like, I'm not here judging or acting out of contempt or trying to make you feel small. I feel anxious, right? Because I've heard it before because I'm not perfect, like, when I say you did this, or what's going on, this is like anxiety up the wazoo. Like, if I'm speaking for how they're feeling, as opposed to like, hey, I'm frustrated, I'm really worried that you did that, let's like how can I help, or let's talk about this, is different than like you, right? Okay. The biggest thing is ors when you try and have this conversation. We want open-ended questions, right? We want to be able to like let that part of the brain is trying to be abstract, right? You got to give it space and give it time. Don't ask closed-ended questions where you can just get yes or no, because you're naturally going to get yes or no anyways, because we're talking about adolescence. But continuing to foster a conversation around open-ended questions, like I'm going to give you place to expand or give me context about what's going on, and then affirming when like, all right, thanks for talking to me, like thanks for saying it like that, and that helps me understand, or that was great, you did say no to that, or you did do affirmations as part of your conversations are going to keep it going. Reflections, when we were talking about how does healthy relationships help avoid addiction, that firing of neurons to think about emotions or what the other person is thinking, we can promote that through reflections, right? If I see, when I use it, Thea, if Thea looks tense, and her words don't necessarily match what she's saying she's good, she's cool, she's fine, but she's looking tense and anxious, like, hey, I'm feeling some anxiety here. I'm like, it looks like you're anxious. How can I help? Right? What you're doing is you're creating opportunity to either have like feel validated, that person feels felt, you can feel what they're feeling, or actually it's a good thing okay to be wrong too, because what they're going to do is correct you. And if they're correcting you, that means the conversation is continuing, right? It was an invitation to talk more about this. Summaries about what you're hearing back. You don't want to parrot, but you want to be able to summarize the main points during conversation. So step one is just having a conversation, and hopefully these tools of I statements and using ors can help you during that process. You're not going to learn it overnight. It's going to take time. It's going to take practice. Any questions or concerns there?
Yes, we do have a question related to this. Is it helpful to speak about our own past experiences around substances and experimentation when we're talking to our kids, and also things we want them to avoid? And how much transparency should we go for when we're trying to share our experiences with our kids? What's off limits? What age is it appropriate to share with our kids?
So this is actually kind of a common question with just some of the younger therapists that I supervise. there's a disclosure that's helpful, and then there's like a disclosure that's not so helpful, right? And in the sense of like my story. The kind of disclosure that's probably more often than not is from those experiences, how did you feel during them, right? Because we're trying to work out that part of the brain that's going to help put a break in their own independent actions. Being able to model that I felt scared. All right, like, listen, I did try that one time. I got talked into it. Like, I didn't feel good about not being in control of what was going on, and I felt scared afterwards, right? Your disclosure is modeling emotional regulation, opportunity to experience the emotions, right, together. That kind of transparency will help, right? Disclosure in the conversation itself. If you say, hey, this conversation is really awkward and it's making me feel anxious, so I get it, right? But then I tried, like, how do we navigate this together, right? That kind of disclosure continues to foster the kind of workout that you're hoping to get in the brain. Does that make sense? So yeah, disclose that you may have tried things. You don't have to get into the nitty gritty, and you don't have to get into the gloom and doom of some of the consequences. But if you are hanging out around the area of sharing how you felt during those experiences, that can be more of a benefit than necessarily just talking about the facts and details that can help people get lost or sidetracked.
That's helpful. So it's more about the emotional experience and less about just the war stories.
Yes.
All right, thank you.
All right. So I showed you the do's. I'm going to show you the don'ts of a conversation. So we call these the 4 horsemen of communication. More often than not, if you're using these in the conversation's not going to get anywhere, and it's going to just be like battle flags up, and we're not defensive and I'm guarded, right? So if we go in with those you statements and we're criticizing, this is the same, like an example I use often is if I come home late and the garbage is not taken out. If I come in and look at my oldest or my middle son and like, are you kidding me? You couldn't even take out the garbage, right? Like, that's criticism. Not only is it criticism, it's also contempt, because I'm also saying, I'm better than you, I'm up here, and you're like ridiculous for like not even able to do this, and you're not as much, right? I'm not saying that, but I'm implying that by my tone and by how I'm going in and criticizing right away, right? As opposed to if I came home late at night, like, oh man, listen, I'm tired. I want to be able to do this right now, but I got to go check in on your brother. Can you help me out? And can you take the garbage out, please? Like, I know it's a really small, minor example, but when you're going to a conversation about addiction or substance or risky behaviors, you don't want to go in criticizing. You don't want to go in acting as if you're big, they're small. You knew the right thing to do the whole time, and you got to be crazy for trying that. Like, let's remember, right? They're programmed to take risks and on purpose so they can grow, and they don't even have the full capacity to analyze those risks after they happen. Like, they need to have those experiences to even get the capacity to analyze later. So have empathy for getting into a risky situation. I mean, you can have boundaries and you can be like supportive of what the right thing is, but have empathy first. Have I statements about how you felt scared that they did that, or you know, frustrated or nervous, right? And that creates an invitation to have a conversation, as opposed to criticizing or contempt, and then that just makes everyone feel guarded. The other one is stonewalling, and the other is defensiveness. So in these conversations, like during the adolescent development period, we're programmed to take risks, and we're also being programmed to challenge. Like, what we were being told was the right or wrong way, we're learning there's different ways now, whether we're in middle school or high school and have more people in our lives to give us different perspectives. I'm listening more to my friends who are telling me different things, or coaches or teachers. There's more access to the world now. So I'm getting different viewpoints, and I'm learning that my parents or my caregivers weren't always right or wrong, right? So you're gonna get some pushback or some challenging. Being defensive in that conversation and sticking to your guns, or not coming like that disclosure of like, I want to help, getting stuck on the details, that kind of stuff, that leads to defensiveness, will get you into a power struggle. And then there's stonewalling, which is like, maybe you went to go start the conversation and then your son or daughter said something and they're like, all right, that's enough, just go to your room, or that's it, I'm good, we'll talk about this later, and then you never go back and talk about it. That's gonna be the focus of the next time you have a conversation, and be a barrier and be another power struggle. Helpful, not helpful, we're on the right track. Any questions from there?
That's great, thank you.
So what help is out there? So you had the conversation, you got an invitation to help from your son or daughter, and they're willing to explore some different things. There's different layers and different like intensities of the kind of help that's out there, right? So there's community support based help. This is AA, NA, Smart Recovery, Refuge Recovery, Celebrate Recovery, and many more, right? Mountainside itself, during the pandemic, because we knew the relationships were important to recovery and to overall healing and growth, we tried to create those experiences virtually, right? So we made support groups online that anyone can go to. We made family and support groups that family members of loved ones who are struggling can go to and find a space and figure out how to navigate this healing process. We made partners and spouses, we made a young people's meeting, and we're not even just doing meetings, we did like meditations and things like that to try and continue to foster and provide a space to practice healthy coping skills. Those are all available, those are all free, and those can be a place to start for someone, right? Maybe they're your son or daughter's talking about it, they recognize that it could be a problem, but they're not really sold on it, and you can be like, all right, let's go to like a young people's meeting together and let's just hear what other people's experiences are like to figure out what's going on, right? So this can be the kind of help initially if things are like a little gray and it's not as clear cut that there's a struggle or a problem. Makes sense? Sound good? Is that helpful?
That's helpful.
Sweet. What else is out there? So there's definitely treatment options. I also want to talk about recovery coaching, which could be a nice intro um, level to like treatment. It's not like full blown therapy session kind of stuff. Recovery coaching is this hybrid between like a sober kind of a coach and a case manager that can help you get to the meetings or go with you to meetings or answer some initial questions you may have and talk to family members about for you if you're struggling to do it with you. And so it could be great in kind of a boots on the ground with you in your community or in your experience. So that's recovery coaching. Thea, I don't know, was Ian able to make it today, Thea?
No, unfortunately, Ian wasn't able to make it. He's one of our coaches that works a lot with adolescents, but Rick, who is one of our coaches as well out of Wilton, I believe is still on. Yeah, Rick is still here with us. He's one of our coaches as well.
So recovery coaching is great. A lot of them, it's like a professional everything, like a Swiss Army knife. So they can help you with a lot of different things. If you have any questions when we get to if we have time or space, like Rick can definitely help you and talk about it from a first person perspective. The treatment options that are out there, and I know a lot of things get thrown into you when you start trying to explore online or talk to people. Inpatient services is that break that I was talking about before, where we just get removed from the dangerous situation to even get a space to even slow down and think about what's going on, right? There's detox programs, which vary. Like it's a medical detox. So some people, their withdrawals, physical withdrawals from everything could be 2 or 3 days, or it could be 7 days, 10 days. It all depends on the scenario, right? Basically, they're not going to get moved on from detox until they're medically cleared. Just for background, there is, if someone's actively struggling and abusing benzodiazepines, so Xanax and all that other kind of stuff, Valium, or alcohol, there is the potential risk factor for strokes and heart attacks and seizures and everything in between. So that withdrawal could potentially be fatal. So it's always better to be doing that in a detox program where the medical team is there to support you during any of those possible scenarios if they arise. Residential programs, those are, I guess, what we think of when we either see them on TV or rehabs or anything else in between. They're 30 to 90 days, right? These are 24/7 care. You're going to a campus or a facility or a treatment center. I'll use Mountainside because I'm from Mountainside. You are going to be able to try different coping skills. You'll have traditional treatment the way we think of with a clinician or a therapist, but then at Mountainside you also have the wellness team that does acupuncture, meditation, qigong, everything in between, to try and create that bottom-up approach of experiences of finding other ways to cope. Being on a campus with others also is fostering a sense of community, right? Trying to get those healthy attachments up and get that part of the brain starting to heal and go and fire. Those are inpatient kind of treatments, right? Those are like, there's no doubt, like people are really struggling, they need help, and they need the support of 24/7 care, right? Outpatient services, that's kind of where my role is. Intensive outpatient programs, or IOP, you hear that thrown around a lot. It's the highest level of outpatient care we can give. And what that means is it means a lot of clinical time, so a lot of group time, and that could be Monday. IOPs could be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or they could be 5 days a week. Ours starts at 4 days and then titrates down to 3 days and then works to a lower level, which is the outpatient program. But basically, what it would look like is you'd be in group, co-occurring group. From Canaan has evening IOP from 6 to 9, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, then Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and then as you add more structure and routine, add more community supports, try new coping skills, you work your way down. And then there's the outpatient level, which could look anywhere from just once a week individual treatment to once a week individual treatment and group, or 2 groups and individual treatment. It could be anything in between, but it's a lower level of care and less intense, not as not as much clinical time. And then there's psychiatry, which is actually a part of intensive outpatient programs. More often than not, there's different kinds of MATS treatments, whether Vivitrol, Sublocade, that can help with cravings and bleed blockers and things of that nature, and abuse and naltrexone for alcohol. people struggling with opiates or heroin, we have Sublocade and buprenorphine and things like that that can help start the healing process, give someone space to try new things, and add this extra supports to build towards their recovery program the way they want to make it, right? But we have to help people get a chance to even try new things, and those kind of mats can be helpful. Any questions or concerns there about treatment and different things? I know I kind of breezed through it because I know we're running out of time.
Well, someone did put a good question in about educational resources for kids. So when you've reached a certain point, obviously you need all of these sorts of interventions. What about when you're still in prevention mode? Are there resources that you can recommend for parents to help their kids understand addiction risk and impact of substance use?
So at that community support level, you have young people's meetings and things of that nature that can be helpful, right? If we're exploring it and talking about it. So for like Mountainside has a young people's meeting on, I think, on Wednesday night, which is free. It's support. You can come and go as you please. It's not an official kind of a treatment thing. I always think at least even preventative, if you've seen some kind of signs or struggles or just we're all struggling emotionally at this point. Individual therapy at the outpatient level, whether it's once a week or every other week or things like that, can give psychoeducation during those sessions, but also start practicing other ways to cope or start bringing more things to awareness. So I think preventative, definitely community supports and things of that nature. I think some schools even have supports with their own social work or school psychologist or community centers like the Boys and Girls Club will have supports too. But I think a private practice therapist or an outpatient therapist at an individual level can get that ball rolling too. And sometimes it's enough to get the help that you're needed.
Okay, that's helpful. And I also did put in the chat a link for folks to Wilton Youth Council's resource page, and we have links to a variety of resources on the web on different topics that people might find helpful.
Awesome, thanks. Anything else going on? Are we good? Oh, that's the last slide. So key points or takeaways. Just remember that the relationship between adolescence and addiction is relationships, right? Our brain is programming us to have experiences, take more risks during this time in our lives, and that can be great and it can be good, but it also can lead to dangerous situations and often can lead to experimenting with weed or drinking or everything in between. We've all been there, we know it. It's probably come up for us before, right? So it's not, death sentence is not a bad thing. It's that game of risk and protective factors. If you have more protective factors in place, yeah, I have different ways to cope. Like I do breath work, I have music, I play sports, or I have healthy relationships, or I draw, or anything in between. I have different ways to manage the feelings I'm feeling. And so when I experimented with that stuff, I recognized it wasn't that great, and I have other ways of dealing with it, right? But if there are other risk factors, whether it's depression, anxiety, ADHD, or there's trauma in someone's past life, and then things like that, it's always helpful to recognize those, be aware of them, do the best you can to adapt to them. You can have the community supports to try and alleviate some of that stress and anxiety, or again, like the individual therapist, at least at an outpatient level of care, can help navigate when there's more risk factors going on in your life at that moment in time. Hopefully that's helpful. If there's more questions, I don't know how much time we have because I've just been talking and relying on Thea and everyone else. So if there is more time, I'll be happy to answer any more questions.
This has been great, Tony. And there is one more question. It's been in the Q&A for a while, and I'd like to get it to you before we leave, which is, if you feel better when you use healthier coping skills, then why do people relapse?
Right. So you do feel better when you're using healthy coping skills, but you need to practice and repetition, and then that highway, that neural pathway, that short circuit is always going to be there, right? So things can be at any one point or time can be different, and I like Dan Siegel's metaphors for trying just on a daily basis for life. We have a window of tolerance, whether we're talking about trauma or whether we're talking about addiction, ADHD, depression, just a normal window where we can maintain our flexibility. We can use that part of the brain to help us make a plan or adapt or evolve to the situation, right? But if we're using those good coping skills, but then life throws more curveballs at us, or other things come into play, or I start feeling lonely, or my routine drifts off a little bit, I could get overwhelmed, and then I fall out of my window of tolerance. Whether that's becoming like if a river, if you're above the water, it's chaotic. If you're below it, you're rigid. If we lose balance and fall out of that window of tolerance, we can result back to drinking because we know it will cope and will help because these coping skills weren't enough, right? So different moments, things fluctuate. Coping skills will not always will always be there, but if life is throwing a lot at you, like right now, I think there's been more relapses and struggles now because of the added extra stress that life has brought, whether it's been more isolation, whether it's been more anxiety, or I know there's been a term being thrown around called crisis fatigue, but this period itself is almost like a societal trauma for us to experience together. Some people have more protective factors in place and can navigate, and some others will struggle more because they have more risk factors in place. So it's a different story for every person, and so that's why it can still happen. That road will always be there. It'll be overgrown. It'll look creepy. It'll be potholes and all that stuff. But if we ever just slightly call it recurrent symptoms, or if we slip a little bit, it will start repaving that road and make it more attractive. And eventually we'll get right back to where we were pretty quick, actually, if we were struggling with addiction at a prior level.
Thank you so much, Tony. In the interest of time, I think we don't have any more questions in the chat right now or the Q&A, so we might wrap up kind of quickly because we did go over, but this was just wonderful. Thank you, Tony, so much. You just gave us so much information and a lot to think about.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm around if you have any more questions too. I'll be happy to answer through email or anything that you have, and I can give that to everyone. So.
Great, and thanks to everybody who watched and submitted questions. You made it so much more vibrant. In the chat, you're going to find Thea Ross's phone number, and you can call her to connect with Tony. The webinar is going to be posted on our website, wiltonyouth.org, and on SpedNet, Wilton's website. You can rewatch it. You can tell your friends about it. There's also in the chat links to find information about Mountainside's support groups. And please do click the link to our program evaluation because that helps us make our programs better. Gosh, thanks to everyone. Tony, thank you so very much. This was terrific.
Bye.